I want to talk for a few minutes this morning, hopefully not more than 10 or 12 minutes, to those Christians whose life and whose faith and whose religion seems to have gone off track. You may have been a Christian all your life. You may have been a Christian for a short time. And you've experienced the reality of Christ in your life, but now he seems to have disappeared. You feel like you're out in a desert. God does not appear to be hearing your prayers, let alone answering them. And your life is a struggle, and it doesn't seem to be getting fixed. I want to speak to that from the Bible to offer you hope and encouragement and let you know that you're not alone and you're not the first person that's ever gone through this or had the sense that maybe God either doesn't exist or that he's abandoned you. I want to talk about Moses. Back in the Old Testament, at the end of Genesis and the book of Exodus, God had made a promise to Abraham that he would have a child who he named Isaac, and through Isaac and his descendants the entire world would be blessed. It would be through his descendants, the Jews, that God would bring a Messiah, a Savior, Jesus Christ. Subsequent to that promise, Isaac's descendants, Jacob and his 12 sons, ran into a famine in the land of Canaan, later to be renamed Israel, and they were forced to leave Canaan and go to Egypt to find food. Joseph, one of the sons, had been placed ahead of time by God to rise to a position of power and influence in Egypt and to be ready when the rest of the sons came to take them in and take care of them. What happened was, over the next several hundred years, the small band or tribe of the sons of Jacob grew into a nation. They became so populous that they threatened the Egyptian population to overrun them. And the king, or Pharaoh at that time, sensing the threat, decided to kill off the Jewish race. He issued an order that all Jewish males were to be killed at birth. One Jewish gal gave birth to a child and decided to try and save them. She built a basket, covered it with tar, floated it in the river, and had her daughter watch the child in that basket to see what happened. Pharaoh's daughter, the king's daughter, came to bathe and found the basket and ended up adopting the child, who was named Moses. So Moses was a Hebrew child, but he grew up in the palace of the king, or Pharaoh, of Egypt, which was the most powerful nation on earth at that time. The Bible tells us in the book of Acts 7:22 that Moses was a prince of Egypt and that he was powerful in word and deed. We also know that he was aware of his Hebrew roots because the Bible also records that he went to visit his relatives and was aware of his Hebrew relations. And I'm quite confident that he was also aware of God's promise to Abraham that the Jewish people would grow into a great nation in Egypt. They would become enslaved, but that at the end of 400 years, God would deliver them, bring them out, and give them the land of Palestine, what we now know as Palestine, and which is Israel. So Moses would have been aware of this. And the Bible records that at one point, Moses went to visit his Jewish people. He was a prince of Egypt. He may have been first or second in line, actually, to the throne of Egypt. But he went to visit his relatives, and he still had a heart for the Jewish or Hebrew people. He saw an Egyptian abusing a Hebrew who had become enslaved, by the way, by the Egyptians. At any rate, this Egyptian was abusing one of the Hebrew slaves. Moses took it upon himself to kill the Egyptian and hide the body. The Bible doesn't spell this out, but I'm quite certain that given Moses' position and his unique circumstances, having been born under a death threat only to be rescued and raised in the halls of power in Egypt as a prince of Egypt, my guess is, and I think it's a pretty good guess, that Moses had a sense of his own destiny as possibly the one who would bring the Hebrew people out of Egypt and back into the land of Canaan. And it may have been that sense which triggered his outrage at the Egyptian and caused him to murder him. What happened next, however, disrupted Moses' plans. The next day, he saw two Hebrew men arguing, and he said, "Why are you arguing? You're brothers." And they turned to him and said, "Who are you to tell us what to do? Are you going to kill us like you did the Egyptian yesterday?" So Moses realized that he had been found out, and he now was a murderer, a known murderer. Pharaoh became aware of it, and Moses hit the road. The Bible records that Moses fled from Egypt, ran east into the deserts, and ended up in what we now know as Saudi Arabia, but in really the wastelands east of Egypt and east of the Red Sea. He ended up in the land of Midian, ended up getting married there, and took a job working for his father-in-law, tending sheep. The Bible also records that Egyptians detested sheep and sheep herders. When Jacob's sons came into Egypt hundreds of years earlier, they were told to settle in the land of Goshen because that was away from the halls of power in the metropolitan areas, and they were kind of isolated, and they were told to live there because they were shepherds, and the Egyptians detested sheep and shepherds. So now our Prince of Egypt, powerful in word and deed, is sitting out in the wastelands of Midian, working for his father-in-law, tending sheep. The Bible goes on to tell us that he was not just tending sheep, he was out in the desert. He was not only out in the desert, but he was tending the herds on the back side of the desert, out in the wastelands. So you have a Prince of Egypt, powerful in word and deed, having been reduced really to not even humble, not even a humble situation, but one that had to have been devastating for a man who was raised in the halls of power and exercised all the authority and influence a man could have, described as powerful in word and deed. Furthermore, the Bible tells us that Moses was 40 years old when he ran, and he was 80 years old when his pilgrimage in the desert came to an end. So what do you suppose was going through Moses' mind for all those 40 years when he was alone tending sheep, working for his father-in-law out in the backside of the desert? We tend to turn biblical people into icons as if they're somehow made of superior clay than the rest of us. That's not true. God uses people, and we all have the same stuff in us. I'm quite certain that Moses, during those 40 years, came to a point where he recognized that his life as he thought it was going to be was over, that his destiny was sealed, that if God had ever had any plans for him, those plans were long since abandoned. And so there he was, 40 years later, out tending sheep for his father-in-law, broken and emptied, really, of any plans or any sense of destiny, until one day he saw a bush burning and not being consumed by the fire. So out of curiosity, he went to investigate, and he found God speaking to him from the fire in the bush. And his first words to Moses were to take off his sandals, because he was standing on holy ground. God went on to call and commission Moses to go back to Egypt and to confront Pharaoh and demand that he let God's people, the Hebrews, go and migrate to their destined promised land, which would become Israel. Moses objected to God's plan for his life at this point. He said, I can't even talk straight. I stutter. I'm slow of speech. God said, that's all right. Take your brother with you and let him talk for you. Moses said, how am I going to convince Pharaoh? Look at me. I'm a shepherd. I don't have any authority or influence. God said, I'll fix that. You have a shepherd's staff in your hand, throw it on the ground. Moses did. It turned into a snake. God said, I'm going to perform signs and wonders through you that will cause Pharaoh, despite the hardness of his heart, to release my people, and you're going to lead them out of Egypt and bring them to the gates of the land that I promised to your forefathers, which he did. So here's some questions for us all, those of us who have spent some time in the desert, wondering if God abandoned us, or wondering if we've lost our purpose in life. Moses spent 40 years on the backside of the desert. The Bible tells us, and Jesus speaks to this in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. He said, the hairs of our head are all numbered. He also tells us that a sparrow doesn't fall to the ground without God's taking note. So if God's eye is on the sparrow, and you're sitting out in a wasteland as we speak, wondering if there is a God even anymore, and why doesn't he hear your prayers? Here's a question for you. God's abandonment of Moses was Moses' perspective. What was God's perspective? I would suggest to you that there was not a single moment in those 40 years where God's eye was not on Moses. He knew exactly where he was, what it would take to sustain him, and more importantly, what it would take to rebuild him and bring him out and use him as his instrument. In point of fact, when God reclaimed Moses, Moses was no longer powerful in word and deed, was he? He said, I can't even speak. Furthermore, the Bible tells us when God brought him out, Moses was now the humblest man on earth. So while Moses was full of himself as a prince of Egypt, he was of no use to God. It wasn't until God dealt with all that pride and all that self-centeredness and sufficiency and all that sense of destiny, and emptied Moses of Moses, that he became useful to God, and God was able to complete his purposes in him. Personally, I know a little bit about desert experiences, and I know a little bit about pride. And there came a point, and I don't say this lightly, I don't see visions or hear voices and so forth, but there was a point where God spoke to me personally when I was going through my own desert experience and questioning where God was, and even shaking my fist at God, having been a Christian for a while, and nothing seemed to be going my way for a long period of time. And God spoke to me. He said, you're going to stay stuck exactly where you are until you deal with your attitude. Jesus said we have to surrender ourselves, get unloaded from all our pride and junk, so that God can complete a work and a plan for each of us. And he has that plan. God says in Jeremiah, he says, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. So if you're wandering in the desert today, wondering if God has abandoned you, if you're shaking your fist at God because he hasn't fixed all your circumstances, let me suggest to you, he's fixing you right now. If you and the sooner you cooperate with the process, the sooner he's likely to bring you out and move you forward. So I would suggest, and we all need to do this from time to time, whether we're out in the desert or not, but I would suggest that each of us examine ourselves every day if necessary and ask ourselves, what are the attitudes and the heart conditions that don't belong in our life, and start surrendering those to God. I would also, if I could embed one principle in the mind of every Christian, it would be this in terms of practical living. God is not planning on fixing every one of our circumstances to our liking. He's planning on using our circumstances to fix our character so that we can each fulfill God's destiny for us. And I would encourage you, first of all, to persevere. Secondly, if you've turned away from God, to turn back to him, to make a choice to trust him, to ask him to reveal to you any things that don't belong in your life, and then start surrendering them. And then to do so, not with a blind faith, but with a faith grounded in hope and a vision of what God's going to do in your life once you get yourself out of the way. Thanks for watching.